Breaking news, protesters clashing with police outside of New York City Hall. This comes ahead of a vote today on the mayor's proposal to cut $1 billion from the NYPD's budget. CNN's Bryn Gingras is live in Lower Manhattan for us this morning with more. Bryn, good morning.
Hey, Erica, good morning to you. Yeah, we've heard the rallying cries across the country to defund the police. Well, as I get out of the way, you can see here in New York, those protests in the street have now turned into an outright encampment in front of City Hall, where you said they clashed with police just this morning. Well, this group is demanding that at least a $1 billion cut be from the NYPD's $6 billion budget. And soon they may know the results of their efforts, as this city needs to vote on a budget today. The demand echoing across the country through voices, signs, and murals, and in some U.S. cities, the call to defund the police is happening with swift momentum. From Seattle,
we are going to focus our greatest efforts on reimagining policing itself.
To Baltimore,
this round of cuts that came with these hearings have demonstrated the will of the people.
To Philadelphia.
We move money from the police department, some money which frankly speaking should never have been in the police department.
According to Local Progress, an organization formed by local elected officials to focus on racial and economic justice, leaders in at least 19 cities or municipalities are calling for cuts to police budgets or to reallocate funds in the millions. In New York City, the NYPD may lose $1 billion. A budget plan put forward by the mayor would redistribute the department's revenues in part to the city's youth.
We want to shift resources more and more into young people in particular, into youth centers. We want to shift resources more and more into public housing.
The mayor insists the proposed cuts aren't punitive. The NYPD brass acknowledges there's room for savings, but says they can't afford fewer officers on the streets.
The number one thing that our community members from every part of the city that I worked in wanted was more police officers.
In Minneapolis, defunding may turn into dismantling. In the wake of calls for change following the murder of George Floyd, the city council officially moved to replace the police force with the Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention. It still needs to be approved by voters.
Our commitment is to end our city's toxic relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department, to end policing as we know it.
The only consequence that I'm seeing in defunding is an immediate spike in violent crime around the country.
Maria Haberfeld, a New York professor of police science, says drastic cuts specifically to department's personnel could be catastrophic.
Defunding police departments doesn't take into consideration the fact that there is crime out there, real crime, violent crime, shootings, rapes, breaking and entering. These types of crimes are not going to be handled by social workers, are not to be handled by other professionals.
And there are a number of cities all across the country whose new fiscal years begin tomorrow. So we really could see the slashing of police budgets in many areas. Keep in mind, John, that there are cities like New York who are dealing with a serious budget deficit caused by the coronavirus and also this national reckoning for police reform. John?
Absolutely. Bryn Gingras, terrific report. Thanks so much. Joining me now is CNN law enforcement analyst Charles Ramsey. He's the former police chief in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. Thanks so much for being with us. Look, as these discussions take place to reduce funding for police, we are seeing in this summer already a rise in certain violent crimes. Here in New York City alone, the number of shootings this year, 503 compared to 350 last year. Now, look, there could be a number of causes here. It could be cabin fever from the pandemic. It could just be the warmer weather. It could be the social unrest. Is there a way to identify how connected the rise in violence is to the calls to defund?
Well, I mean, there is a way of finding out, but it may be too soon to really do that analysis at this point in time. I think what people need to realize with defunding the police, and I can't speak to NYPD because I've never seen their operating budget, but from the 3 departments I've worked in, 90 to 96% of the budget is about personnel costs, pensions, benefits, salaries, things like that. There's no way you can significantly cut budgets without impacting personnel. During the recession in 09, for an example, Mayor Nutter and I decided that we wouldn't lay off policemen, but we wouldn't hire any new police officers. So we allowed attrition to take its toll. It takes a long time to recover from that. And at a time when you've got rising crime rates, not just New York, Philadelphia right now is pushing 200 murders for the 1st of July. I mean, Milwaukee is up, LA is up. I don't know if there's a relationship at this point in time, but it's very, very important that we keep our eye on the ball here and not let crime get out of control. It's also important that if money's going to be taken, where's it going to go? Because cities are facing tremendous deficits right now. If it's going to go to social services, follow the money. Make sure that's where it goes. My fear is the money will be taken from police, but the responsibility for responding to those calls for service that people are talking about now will not go away.
In New York City, and again, I know you say you didn't work in New York, but we're seeing it play out over this 24-hour period, which is why I'm focusing on it. $1 billion budget cut, a big chunk of it will be from canceling the hiring of new officers, which you talked about right there, about 1,600 new officers. And then they're going to shift some of the spending for school officers from the police department to education spending. It's a little bit of just shifting the funding there. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, they're doing that in Philadelphia, too. There was a $33 million cut, I believe, from the Philadelphia budget, but a good chunk of that was moving crossing guards and public safety officers over to the managing director's budget instead. So, I mean, the little smoke and mirrors there in terms of, you know, the announcement of the initial cut and where the money's actually going. But that's fine, as long as those responsibilities go with the money. My concern is that, you know, the money will go, but the response to those calls for service, and one of your guests earlier had mentioned, you know, robbery, rape, murder, social workers aren't going to handle that. And a lot of the calls we respond to, whether it's a person in mental health crisis or what have you, there can be danger there. And so we may not be the lead, but we certainly need to be able to respond. So people need to sit down and carefully think about this. If cuts are necessary, which is fine, but make sure that those cuts make sense and do not put public safety in jeopardy.
What about the responsibility of current police officers? Because we are seeing this rise in retirements. 272 New York police officers filed for retirement in just that 1 month period. You know, I think the feeling among some people is they just said we've had enough.
Well, you know, I used to track my rate of attrition on a regular basis. You can expect X number of retirements per month. But then when you start going over and above that, that's when you start to get concerned. This is a time when it's tough to be a cop right now. And so, yeah, I'm not surprised there's an increase in retirements. But again, you couple that with defunding where you can't hire new people. Now, you're going to attrit at a much higher rate than you would have normally had happen, which also is going to have an impact on your ability to deploy resources where they're needed and so forth. So there's a lot of moving parts to this that have to be taken in consideration. I know Commissioner Shea disbanded his anti-crime unit. A lot of departments are making adjustments now in order to be able to keep their patrol force up to strength.
Yeah, it is a very complicated issue with budget constraints, not to mention the need, very real need for reforms in the face of everything else that's happening right now. Charles Ramsey, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for being with us and helping us understand it.
Thank you.